Welcome to Watlington House. I'm Richard Bennett, one of the trustees here. Normally for Heritage Open Days we would open the house and the gardens and we'd be delighted to take you round, but unfortunately this year is so different. So a virtual tour it is, and we hope you enjoy learning about the history of the house and the garden.
Where we're standing used to be Abbeyland, and in fact it was the area where the monks used to give alms to the poor. The alms were called orts, O-R-T-E-S, so this area was known as the Orts, and even today we have an Orts Road in Reading. So on the 1610 map by John Speed, the actual road, Watlington House, is shown as a row of trees, so there was an avenue. In the Middle Ages and up to Tudor times, wool was the major export staple of England. It was much prized by the Flemish weavers. Berkshire became a big centre for the wool trade, and there are several families in Berkshire became very wealthy as a result. The best known is probably Jack and Newbury, but in Reading it was the Kendrick and the Watlington families who became very prominent on the back of the wool trade. And in fact the Watlingtons also expanded into gunpowder and other activities. Several of the Watlingtons in fact became Mayor of Reading. One, Samuel Watlington, in the 17th century obtained a lease from the corporation to build himself a house, and so he built Watlington House in 1688. We know the exact date because we have two drain pipes on which it stands SWA 1688, and the house he built was obviously in Jacobean times, was at the back of the house, and then some 50 years later it got extended at the front. So Watlington House is in effect in three parts. The front is Georgian, the back is Jacobean, and we're pretty sure that what we call the bothy, the small area by the side, the north side of Watlington House, stood then. It must have been at least Tudor, if not earlier. The Watlingtons' connection with Watlington House ceased by 1780 because that's when the house started to be used as an educational establishment for young ladies, up to 12 young ladies. Mrs. Littleworth started running the establishment, assisted by her daughter, Mrs. Thorogood, and when she died in 1804, Mrs. Thorogood carried on until 1821, when it was taken over by a Mrs. Stevens, and the connection seems to cease around about 1830. The fees were 21 guineas a year, probably around £2,000 a year, and they were taught all the accomplishments. They were taught about English literature, French language, dancing, music, and they actually brought in male instructors for dancing and music and drawing and like. But one curiosity is that in 1794 the property was leased to a Captain Edward Purvis for 62 years at £25 a year. Now he was a military gentleman, and he went off to the Peninsular Wars. In fact, he was at the Battle of Corunna in 1809, when he was almost killed there, and in fact that was when General Moore was killed, and he was actually at the famous funeral of General Moore, which is commemorated by Woolf in his well-known poem. When he returned to England, he became an adjutant of the Berkshire Militia in 1816, and he used to train the Berkshire Militia on a meadow close to Watlington House. We now think that he probably lived in another house, not Watlington House, which was of course being used as an educational establishment, possibly off Market Square. But eventually he retook occupation. He had a very large family with numerous daughters, and recently on an open day a visitor from Melbourne told us a very curious story as to how a curate from St. John's, opposite Watlington House, which was only built in 1830, went to Melbourne. He then came back to this country to marry one of Captain Purvis's daughters, and he brought with him an Aboriginal boy who sadly died young and is buried in London Road Cemetery. In 1929, Kendrick School vacated and went to their present premises, and the future of Watlington House became very uncertain. There was a real danger that it would be demolished, but fortunately local people banded together. There was a great outcry, and the money was raised, £1,772.12 and ninepence, to purchase the property from the council, and a trust was set up to run it. In fact, the freehold was vested in the National Council of Social Services, later the National Council of Voluntary Organisations, and the Watlington House Management Committee took over the actual management of the building. And it was used as a base for Berkshire charities to have their offices. So we had a whole string of Berkshire charities, the Women's Institute, the Red Cross. We even had a Toc Age chapel here. And that charity use and community use has continued until today. At the moment we have the Mills Archives Trust on the ground floor, we have the Gurkhas on the first floor, and we have Berkshire Youth on the top floor, maintaining that charitable occupation of Watlington House as a community building for the use of the good people of Berkshire and of Reading. And of course they can hire the hall, and which many of them do, and that of course generates an income for the trustees, which is then in turn used to maintain the building. It's a perfect circle. Berkshire Gardens Trust were associated with the re-establishment of this garden. One of their members was Gaylor Adair, who is a garden designer, and Gaylor then actually became a trustee and still is a trustee of Watlington House Trust. She used the association with Elias Mashmole and the Oxford Physic Garden to design this garden, and has been going now since 2015. The money for it came in part from a friend of mine called Jeff Hill, who'd been a Gurkha officer. And when he died, I was one of his executors. And because of the Gurkha Association, in effect, the executors made a grant from his estate, which helped to pay for the cost of re-establishing the garden, which we are really so pleased with it because it looks magnificent in all seasons and sets off the house wonderfully. So thank you, Jeff Hill. And thank you, Gaylor, for all your hard work, and thank you, Berkshire Gardens Trust.
Our current project is to refurbish the forecourt to Watlington House, which we based upon some historical documents which show the formal layout of the frontage, which will actually have a direct access from the street pedestrian to the front door. The project is quite ambitious for us, and we have been given a grant by a local charity to assist this. As part of this process, we are going to refurbish the front of this section here with new planting and hornbeam trees in order to have streetscape.
Here we have a knot garden cum parterre, which is basically in the shape of a cross, which is based on the Watlington family coat of arms. Now we've used box hedging here, and we've used lots of bay, we've got lots of bluebells on the go and tulips. So the next part of the job is to get all this ship shape and get all this nicely trimmed. So this is going to be a job that I'm really looking forward to doing.
In 1887, Kendrick Girls' School took the lease over from Reading Borough Council. Initially it was called Kendrick Middle Class Girls' School, but that name did not last for long. During its time here, there were 3 headmistresses, and the school continued operating out of this house until 1829, when it moved to its current site on London Road. Now the hall behind us, that was built in the early 1890s. Well, why did they build that? Well, they had a large number of girls here. It was a mix of infants and seniors in what we call the sixth form, and we know that in 1919 there were 210 students here, plus about 15 teachers. So they needed the space. So this hall was added for assembly purposes, and so they could hold classes and gyms and things like that. In 1919 we have a picture of the students at the back of the house. It's one of those long pictures of the whole school. In that there were 210 students and 15 teachers. And astonishingly there are about 5 boys in the infants, and they must have been terrified. It's a lot of students to accommodate as a school in this house. So in the 1890s the school added the garden hut that you see behind us. It was used for assembly and for additional classroom space, and we still use it today. In 1911, one of the assistant mistresses here was a lady called Edith Pratt, ultimately she became a factory inspector. And after the First World War started in 1914, she became a factory inspector at the Ministry of Munitions. So she would spend her time going round all these factories, inspecting the working conditions there. And of course, most of the workers there were women, so she's a very early advocate of the rights of women in the workplace. She was later appointed to the Women's Auxiliary Army Force, and she spent time in France supporting the troops in the front line. And in 1917, she was the first woman to be awarded the OBE for her war service. And in April 1918, she was appointed the Deputy Commandant of the Women's Royal Air Force, and that was in the very first year of its foundation. And at a HODS event that we held here in 2018, I was explaining the story of Edith and her war service and the RAF, and then suddenly we had the red arrows fly overhead on their way to a Heroes at Highclere event, and that just seems such an appropriate celebration of her life and her contribution.
We started in 2002 in a very small room up on the top floor of the house, and gradually we've expanded with lots of collections coming to us of people who wanted their collections looked after, and so we've gradually taken over several rooms now in the house. We tend to collect documents, artefacts and things like that people have decided they no longer want to keep, or their family want to pass on somewhere where it's going to be kept and looked after. Some of the more unusual things we have that people have given us prove quite interesting actually. There are plates like this that come off machinery in mills, but this one particularly is quite important because we thought at the time, okay, it looks interesting, but when we went into it we found that the United Kingdom of Flour Millers actually donated a whole carriage for a hospital train during the Second World War. And this was actually on coach 16, and we have a photograph of that train, and one of our trustees' father was actually on the train as well. So from just receiving this plate, it turned into a wonderful story, a human story, so it was very, very interesting. Probably one of the biggest libraries on mill books in the whole world as well downstairs, so we're actually still growing all the time. Okay, so these are the ones that I've done so far. That's the one we were looking at before on the screen.
You've got the one here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there we are.
Yeah, they've come out quite well actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how many more of them on it?
We've got another, there's quite a few more to do yet, so it'll keep me busy for the next few days anyway. But no, they come up very well, don't they?